The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez as she adjusted her helmet and checked her radio one final time. At 28, she had already completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, but this mission felt different. The intelligence reports had been coming in for weeks about a major Taliban stronghold hidden in the mountains near Kandahar. What made this operation special was that 40 innocent civilians were being held captive in the compound, used as human shields by the enemy fighters. Maria looked around at her team of 12 soldiers, all seasoned veterans who had been through hell and back together. They called themselves Desert Eagles, and for good reason. In the past 18 months, they had successfully completed over 50 missions without losing a single team member. Maria was their communications specialist, but she was much more than that. She was the lifeline between her team and the outside world, the person who could call in air support, medical evacuation, or backup troops when things went wrong. The morning briefing had been intense. Colonel Harrison had made it clear that this was a rescue mission first and foremost. The civilians had to be saved, but the Taliban fighters in the compound were heavily armed and well prepared for an assault. Intelligence suggested there were at least 30 enemy combatants holed up in a series of connected buildings carved into the mountainside. The only way in was through a narrow valley that offered little cover and multiple positions for enemy snipers. Maria's best friend on the team was Corporal Jake Thompson, a demolitions expert from Texas who could make a bomb out of almost anything. They had been through basic training together 5 years ago and had requested to serve on the same team ever since. Jake had a wife and 2 young daughters back home, and he carried their picture in his helmet wherever he went. Maria often joked that she was jealous of how much he loved his family, since her own romantic relationships never seemed to survive her long deployments overseas. The plan was relatively straightforward, though everyone knew that no plan survives contact with the enemy. They would approach the compound at dawn, using the cover of darkness for the final few kilometers. A second team would create a diversion on the far side of the mountain, while Maria's team infiltrated the main compound. Once they confirmed the location of the hostages, they would coordinate with air support to neutralize the enemy fighters while keeping the civilians safe. As they loaded into their armored vehicles, Maria felt the familiar mixture of excitement and dread that came before every major operation. She had learned long ago to channel that nervous energy into focus and preparation. Her radio equipment was functioning perfectly, her backup batteries were fully charged, and she had memorized the call signs for all the aircraft that would be supporting their mission. The ride to the insertion point took 3 hours through increasingly rough terrain. Maria used the time to study the satellite images of their target one more time. The compound was built into the side of a cliff, with multiple levels connected by narrow walkways and staircases carved into the rock. Intelligence believed the hostages were being held in the lowest level, while the enemy fighters were positioned throughout the upper levels with clear sight lines down into the valley. Lieutenant Peters, their team leader, was a quiet man from Oregon who had earned the respect of every soldier under his command. He rarely raised his voice, but when he spoke, everyone listened. As they neared their destination, he gathered the team for a final briefing in the back of the lead vehicle. "Remember, this is not a search and destroy mission," he said, his voice steady despite the constant bouncing of the truck over rough roads. "Our primary objective is to save those 40 civilians. Everything else is secondary. Maria, you'll be our eyes and ears with command. The moment we have visual confirmation of the hostages, I want you calling in precise coordinates for air support." Maria nodded, checking her equipment one final time. She wore a special vest that allowed her to carry 2 radio units, backup batteries, signal flares, and a detailed map of the area marked with all the predetermined coordinates for potential airstrikes. She also carried a standard assault rifle and enough ammunition to fight her way out of trouble if necessary. As dawn approached, the team dismounted from their vehicles about 5 kilometers from the target compound. They would cover the remaining distance on foot, using natural cover and moving in small groups to avoid detection. The terrain was challenging, with loose rocks and steep inclines that made silent movement almost impossible. Every step had to be calculated to avoid starting a landslide that would alert the enemy to their presence. Maria found herself paired with Jake for the approach, which made her feel more confident. They had developed an almost telepathic ability to communicate during operations, using hand signals and facial expressions that had been refined over dozens of missions together. As they picked their way carefully through the rocky terrain, Jake suddenly held up his hand and pointed toward a ridge about 300 meters ahead. Through her binoculars, Maria could see the telltale glint of metal that suggested an enemy sniper position. She immediately got on the radio to warn the rest of the team, speaking in the coded language they had all memorized. Within minutes, Lieutenant Peters had repositioned the entire team to avoid the potential threat, and they continued their approach, using a longer but safer route. The sun was fully up by the time they reached their final position, a cluster of large boulders that provided excellent cover while offering a clear view of the compound entrance. Maria set up her primary radio equipment and established contact with the command center back at base. Her secondary radio was tuned to the frequency used by the air support team, 2 Apache helicopters that were circling several kilometers away, waiting for orders. Through her scope, Maria could see movement inside the compound. Armed fighters were moving between the different levels, and she counted at least 20 enemy combatants in defensive positions. What worried her most was that she couldn't see any sign of the hostages. If the civilians were being held in the underground sections of the compound, it would make the rescue much more complicated and dangerous. Lieutenant Peters made the decision to move closer. Intelligence had been wrong about the compound's defenses, and they needed better information before calling in air support. The team would advance in 2 groups, with Maria and 3 other soldiers providing overwatch, while the rest moved to a position where they could actually see into the lower levels of the compound. As the first group began their advance, Maria felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with active combat operations. Her job was to monitor both radio frequencies, keep track of her team's position, and be ready to call in air support the moment Lieutenant Peters gave the order. She had done this dozens of times before, but it never got easier. The responsibility of coordinating between ground forces and air support meant that a single mistake on her part could result in friendly fire casualties. The morning was eerily quiet except for the occasional sound of loose rocks falling down the mountainside. Maria scanned the compound continuously through her scope, looking for any change in the enemy's defensive positions. She noticed that several of the fighters seemed nervous, constantly checking their weapons and looking toward the sky. It was possible that they knew an attack was coming, which would make the mission much more dangerous for everyone involved. Jake was positioned about 10 meters to her right, his demolitions equipment ready in case they needed to blast through any doors or walls. He caught her eye and gave her a thumbs up, the same gesture he had used before every mission for the past 3 years. Maria smiled back, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this operation. The enemy seemed too well prepared, and the hostage situation added a level of complexity that made her uncomfortable. 20 minutes into the advance, Lieutenant Peters' voice crackled through her headset. His team had reached a position where they could see into the compound's main courtyard, and they had visual confirmation of the hostages. 40 civilians, mostly women and children, were being held in a large room on the lowest level. The good news was that they appeared to be unharmed. The bad news was that the room was surrounded by armed guards, and there was only one entrance. Maria immediately began relaying this information to the command center and the air support team. The coordinates were precise, and the Apache pilots confirmed they had eyes on the target. However, the proximity of the hostages to the enemy fighters meant that any airstrike would have to be incredibly precise to avoid civilian casualties. As Maria was coordinating the air support, she heard Jake's voice through her earpiece. "Contact front," he said calmly, which meant that enemy fighters had spotted their position. Within seconds, the quiet morning was shattered by the sound of automatic gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Maria immediately dropped behind her cover and tried to maintain radio contact while bullets whined overhead. The firefight intensified quickly, with enemy fighters firing from multiple positions around the compound. Maria could hear Lieutenant Peters shouting orders to his team, but the radio reception was being affected by all the gunfire and explosions. She realized that the enemy had been waiting for them, and this was likely a carefully planned ambush. Despite the chaos around her, Maria managed to establish contact with the Apache helicopters and began directing them toward the enemy positions. The pilots were experienced and professional, but they couldn't engage targets that were too close to her team's position without risking friendly fire casualties. She needed to provide them with precise coordinates for enemy positions that were far enough away from her team to be safely engaged. As the battle continued, it became clear that her team was outnumbered and outgunned. The enemy fighters had the advantage of prepared positions and knew the terrain better than anyone. Lieutenant Peters made the difficult decision to fall back to a more defensible position, but this meant leaving the hostages in enemy hands for the time being. Maria was gathering her radio equipment to move when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round, followed immediately by the thunderous explosion that shook the ground beneath her feet. The enemy was using heavy weapons, which meant the situation had just become much more serious. The battle was just beginning, and Maria knew that the next few hours would determine whether 40 innocent people lived or died. As she prepared to move to a new position, she had no idea that the most challenging part of her mission was still ahead of her, and that her own survival would soon depend on her ability to crawl through hell itself to save not just the mortar explosions were getting closer with each round, and Maria could feel small pieces of shrapnel pinging off the rocks around her position. Lieutenant Peters was shouting for the team to move to the fallback position, a series of larger boulders about 200 meters down the slope that would provide better protection from the heavy weapons fire. Maria quickly packed her primary radio into its protective case and slung it across her back. Her secondary radio remained active on her vest, maintaining contact with the Apache helicopters that were still circling overhead, waiting for clear targets. As she prepared to move, Jake appeared beside her, breathing heavily from the sprint between cover positions. "Ready to move?" he asked, checking his demolitions pack to make sure nothing had been damaged by the explosions. Maria nodded and pointed toward the fallback position. "You go first. I'll be right behind you." Jake took off at a low run, zigzagging between the rocks to make himself a harder target for enemy snipers. Maria watched him for a few seconds to make sure he reached cover safely, then began her own movement down the slope. The terrain was treacherous, with loose stones that threatened to send her tumbling with every step. She was about halfway to the fallback position when the world suddenly exploded around her. The improvised explosive device had been carefully hidden beneath a pile of rocks that looked completely natural. It was what military experts called a pressure plate IED, designed to detonate when someone stepped on a concealed trigger mechanism. The Taliban fighters had obviously spent considerable time preparing this ambush site, placing multiple explosive devices along the most likely routes that attacking forces would use. Maria never saw the device that changed her life forever. One moment she was running across what appeared to be solid ground, and the next moment she was flying through the air as the world turned into a blinding flash of light and deafening noise. The explosion launched her nearly 10 meters through the air before she crashed into a cluster of jagged rocks. When consciousness returned, Maria found herself lying on her back, staring up at the bright blue Afghan sky. Her ears were ringing so loudly that she couldn't hear anything else, and there was a strange metallic taste in her mouth that she would later learn was her own blood. For several long moments, she couldn't remember where she was or what had happened to her. Slowly, the memories began to return. The mission, the compound, the firefight. Jake running ahead of her toward the fallback position. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as waves of pain crashed over her like a physical force. Something was very wrong with her legs. Looking down at her body, Maria saw a sight that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, with white bone visible through torn fabric and flesh. Her right leg wasn't much better, with what appeared to be multiple fractures and massive bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Both legs were essentially useless, and the pain was so intense that it made thinking clearly almost impossible. Maria's military training kicked in despite the overwhelming pain. She needed to assess her situation and figure out how to survive. Her primary radio had been torn from her back by the explosion and was lying about 5 meters away, its case cracked open and electronic components scattered across the rocks. Her secondary radio was still attached to her vest, but when she tried to use it, she got only static. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, which meant that enemy fighters were probably moving to investigate the explosion. If they found her alive, she would either be killed immediately or taken prisoner. Neither option was acceptable, especially since she was the only person on her team who could coordinate with air support to save the hostages. Maria tried to drag herself toward her primary radio, using her arms to pull her broken body across the rough ground. Every movement sent lightning bolts of agony through her shattered legs, and she could feel warm blood soaking into the fabric of her uniform. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, she reached the radio and discovered that it was completely destroyed. Circuit boards and wires were scattered everywhere, and the antenna had been snapped in half. Panic began to set in as Maria realized the full scope of her situation. She was badly injured, possibly dying, and cut off from communication with her team and air support. The hostages were still in danger, and her teammates were probably assuming she was dead. Without her ability to coordinate airstrikes, the mission would likely fail, and 40 innocent people would remain in enemy hands. But Maria had not survived 3 combat tours by giving up when things looked hopeless. She forced herself to think rationally about her options. Her secondary radio was damaged, but might still be functional if she could find a way to boost its signal. The fallback position where her team was located was about 200 meters away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world given her condition. Maria made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't know her. She was going to crawl those 200 meters to reach her team, no matter how long it took or how much it hurt. The lives of 40 civilians and the success of the mission depended on her ability to re-establish communications with air support. The first few meters were the worst. Every time Maria pulled herself forward with her arms, her broken legs dragged across the rocky ground, sending waves of pain so intense that she nearly lost consciousness several times. She quickly learned to bite down on a piece of fabric torn from her uniform to keep from crying out and alerting enemy fighters to her location. Blood loss was becoming a serious problem. Maria could see a dark trail behind her, marking her progress across the rocks, and she was beginning to feel dizzy and weak. She knew from her medical training that she probably had only a limited amount of time before shock set in and made further movement impossible. She had to keep going while she still had the strength. After the first 50 meters, Maria developed a rhythm that allowed her to move more efficiently despite the pain. She would pull herself forward about 2 meters, then rest for a minute while scanning the area for enemy movement. During these rest periods, she continued trying to raise someone on her secondary radio, adjusting the antenna and checking different frequencies in hopes of making contact. The sun was getting higher, and the temperature was rising rapidly. Maria hadn't brought much water with her, assuming the mission would be completed quickly. Now she was beginning to worry about dehydration on top of everything else. She forced herself to take only small sips from her water bottle, trying to make it last as long as possible. Halfway to her destination, Maria encountered her first major obstacle. The terrain dropped off into a small ravine that was about 3 meters deep and filled with loose rocks and thorny bushes. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a minor inconvenience that could be crossed in less than a minute. In her current condition, it looked like an impossible barrier. Maria spent several minutes studying the ravine, looking for the safest route across. She finally decided to work her way down one side, cross the bottom, and then somehow climb up the other side. It was going to be extremely difficult and painful, but there was no other option. The descent into the ravine was a controlled fall more than anything else. Maria used her arms to slow her slide down the rocky slope, but she couldn't prevent her legs from bouncing off obstacles along the way. By the time she reached the bottom, she was bleeding from dozens of new cuts and scrapes, and the pain in her legs had reached levels she hadn't known were possible. Crossing the bottom of the ravine required Maria to crawl through thorny bushes that tore at her uniform and exposed skin. She could hear voices in the distance, speaking in what sounded like Pashto, which meant enemy fighters were somewhere nearby. She forced herself to move as quietly as possible despite her desperate situation. The climb up the far side of the ravine nearly broke Maria's spirit. She had to grab onto rocks and roots to pull herself up the steep slope, and several times loose stones gave way beneath her, sending her sliding back down. Her arms were getting tired from supporting her entire body weight, and she was beginning to wonder if she had enough strength left to complete the journey. But every time Maria felt like giving up, she thought about the 40 hostages who were depending on her and about her teammates who were probably planning a desperate assault without air support. She thought about Jake and his 2 little daughters who were waiting for their father to come home safely. She thought about all the other missions her team had completed successfully because she had been there to coordinate with air support when they needed it most. Inch by inch, Maria pulled herself up the slope until she finally reached level ground again. She was now about 3/4 of the way to her destination, but she was also running out of strength. Her arms were shaking with exhaustion, and she was having trouble focusing her vision. She knew that shock was setting in, which meant her body was beginning to shut down from blood loss and trauma. Maria tried her radio again and was amazed to hear a faint voice through the static. It was one of the Apache pilots, calling for an update on the ground situation. She keyed her microphone and tried to respond, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The pilot couldn't hear her clearly and asked her to repeat her transmission. Using every bit of strength she had left, Maria spoke as loudly as she could into her radio microphone. "Apache 1, this is Desert Eagle Communications. I am wounded and mobile, approximately 100 meters from team position. Primary radio destroyed. Need immediate air support for hostage rescue operation." The pilot's response was crystal clear despite the static. "Desert Eagle Communications, we have been searching for you. Your team reported you missing in action after the explosion. What is your condition and can you coordinate airstrikes?" Maria looked ahead toward the fallback position where she could see muzzle flashes from her teammates' weapons as they continued to fight off enemy attacks. She was so close now, but still so far away. Her radio signal was weak, but it was working. If she could just get a little closer, she might be able to coordinate the air support that could save everyone. "Apache 1, I can coordinate strikes if you can boost signal. Moving to team position now. Stand by for target coordinates." The final 100 meters took Maria longer than all the distance she had already covered. Her body was operating on pure determination now, as shock and blood loss had pushed her far beyond normal human endurance. Every few meters, she had to stop and force herself to stay conscious, using techniques she had learned in survival training to fight off the darkness that kept trying to claim her. As she got closer to her team's position, Maria could hear Lieutenant Peters shouting orders above the constant sound of gunfire. The enemy had brought up more heavy weapons, and her teammates were taking increasingly accurate fire from multiple directions. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions scattered throughout the compound, and it was clear that her team was seriously outnumbered. Jake's voice suddenly crackled through her radio, though she couldn't tell if he was speaking to her or to someone else on the team. "Where the hell is our air support? We've got hostiles moving to flank our position, and we can't hold this position much longer." Maria keyed her microphone with trembling fingers. "Jake, this is Maria. I'm alive and approximately 50 meters from your position. I can coordinate airstrikes, but I need you to help boost my radio signal." The immediate silence that followed her transmission was broken by Jake's incredulous voice. "Maria? Holy hell, we thought you were dead. Where are you? Are you injured?" "I'm injured but functional," Maria replied, which was the biggest understatement of her military career. "I'm approaching from the east side of your position. I need you to set up a signal booster so I can coordinate with the Apaches." Lieutenant Peters's voice cut through the radio chatter with characteristic calm authority. "Maria, this is Peters. Glad to hear your voice. Jake is setting up the booster now. We've got enemy movement on 3 sides and need air support immediately. What's your status on target coordinates?" Maria could see her teammates now, crouched behind the large boulders that formed their defensive position. Jake was working frantically to connect a signal amplifier to his radio equipment, while the other team members maintained covering fire against the attacking enemy forces. She was so close to safety, but she still had to cross about 30 meters of open ground that was being swept by enemy fire. "I have coordinates for multiple targets," Maria replied, pulling out her waterproof map case with coordinates already marked. "But I need to reach your position to coordinate effectively. Can you provide covering fire for my approach?" Lieutenant Peters immediately began organizing covering fire to protect Maria's final approach. 3 soldiers took positions where they could see the enemy fighters who had clear shots at the open ground Maria needed to cross. On Peters's signal, they began rapid fire at the enemy positions, forcing the hostile fighters to take cover. Maria used every last bit of her strength to drag herself across that final stretch of rocky ground. Her broken legs left a trail of blood behind her, and twice she nearly lost consciousness from the pain. But she kept moving. The sound of bullets whining overhead and striking the rocks around her was terrifying, but she focused only on reaching the safety of her team's position. When she finally reached the boulder that Jake was using for cover, he grabbed her by the arms and pulled her the last few feet to safety. The expression on his face when he saw the extent of her injuries was something Maria would never forget. His eyes went wide with shock and horror, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "Jesus Christ, Maria," he whispered, looking at her mangled legs. How are you even alive?" "Don't have time to explain," Maria gasped, accepting the signal booster that Jake handed her. "Help me set up the coordinates for air support. Those hostages aren't going to save themselves." Jake immediately switched into professional mode, helping Maria connect her radio to the signal amplifier while she spread out her map and began calculating precise coordinates for airstrikes. The boost in signal strength was immediately apparent, and she could hear the Apache pilots clearly for the first time since the explosion. "Apache 1 and 2, this is Desert Eagle Communications. I have multiple targets for immediate engagement. Are you ready to copy coordinates?" The lead pilot's voice was crisp and professional. "Desert Eagle Communications, this is Apache 1. We are ready to copy. Be advised, we have visual on your position and can see enemy movement throughout the target area." Maria began reading off the coordinates for enemy positions, starting with the heavy weapons teams that were causing the most problems for her team. She had spent years training to do exactly this job, and despite her injuries and blood loss, her mind was still sharp enough to calculate the precise locations needed for effective airstrikes. "Apache 1. First target is heavy machine gun position. Grid coordinates 41S MD 123-456. Distance from friendly forces is approximately 400 meters, bearing 090 degrees from our position." "Copy first target," the pilot replied. Visual confirmed on heavy machine gun position. Ready for engagement on your command. Maria looked at Lieutenant Peters, who nodded grimly. All Desert Eagle elements, take cover. Danger close air support incoming. Apache 1, you are cleared hot on target 1. Repeat, cleared hot. The sound of the Apache's 30mm chain gun firing was like nothing else Maria had ever heard. The helicopter's position allowed the pilot to engage the enemy machine gun team with devastating accuracy, and within seconds the heavy weapons fire that had been pinning down her team was silenced permanently. Target 1 destroyed, the pilot reported. Ready for next target. Maria immediately gave coordinates for a mortar team that had been dropping rounds uncomfortably close to their position. Once again, the Apache's precision fire eliminated the threat within moments. Enemy fighters throughout the compound were now taking cover, which gave Lieutenant Peters the opportunity he had been waiting for. Maria, can you coordinate a strike on the main building where the hostages are being held? We need to take out the guards without harming the civilians. This was the most challenging target Maria had ever been asked to coordinate. The hostages were being held in a room on the ground floor of the main building, while enemy fighters were positioned on the upper floors and roof. Any mistake in the coordinates could result in civilian casualties, which would turn a rescue mission into a tragic failure. Maria studied her map carefully, cross-referencing the satellite imagery with the intelligence reports they had received before the mission. She calculated coordinates for the upper floors of the building, where intelligence suggested most of the guards were positioned. The margin for error was incredibly small, but it was their best chance to save the hostages. Apache 2, I have coordinates for precision strikes on upper floors of main building. Hostages are confirmed on ground floor, grid coordinates 41S MD 125-458. Enemy fighters are on floors 2 and 3 of same building. The second Apache pilot's voice reflected the seriousness of the situation. Desert Eagle communications? Understand hostages on ground floor. Enemy on upper floors. This will require precision engagement with minimal explosive ordnance. Confirm you want us to engage upper floors only. That is correct, Apache 2. Hostages are directly below target area. Precision engagement only, upper floors of main building. Lieutenant Peters was already organizing his team for the rescue assault. The plan was for the Apache to neutralize the guards on the upper floors, then the team would assault the building and extract the hostages before any remaining enemy fighters could react. It was risky, but it was their best option given the circumstances. All Desert Eagle elements, prepare for assault on main building. Maria, coordinate the strike in 30 seconds. Then we move immediately. Maria watched the seconds tick by on her watch, knowing that the lives of 40 innocent people depended on the precision of the coordinates she had calculated. When the 30 seconds were up, she keyed her microphone one final time. Apache 2, you are cleared hot on upper floors of main building. Repeat, cleared hot on upper floors only. The Apache's missiles struck the upper floors of the compound with surgical precision, collapsing portions of the building while leaving the ground floor intact. Enemy fighters who weren't killed in the initial strikes were forced to abandon their positions, which gave Lieutenant Peters' team the opening they needed. Go, go, go! Peters shouted, and his soldiers began their assault on the main building. Maria watched through her scope as her teammates moved with practiced efficiency toward the compound. Jake led the way with his demolition equipment, ready to blast through any doors that might be blocking access to the hostages. Despite her injuries, Maria felt a surge of pride as she watched her team execute the rescue operation with perfect coordination. The assault on the building took less than 10 minutes. Jake's explosive charges blew open the reinforced door that led to the hostage area, and within moments the team was evacuating 40 terrified but unharmed civilians from their underground prison. Women and children who had been held captive for weeks were finally free, thanks to the courage and skill of 12 American soldiers and the precision air support that Maria had coordinated despite her devastating injuries. As the evacuation continued, Maria finally allowed herself to acknowledge how badly she was hurt. The adrenaline that had kept her functioning was beginning to wear off, and the pain in her legs was becoming unbearable. Jake appeared beside her with a medical kit and began working to stop her bleeding while they waited for medical evacuation helicopters to arrive. "You saved them all, you know," Jake said as he applied pressure bandages to her wounds. "Those 40 people are alive because you refused to give up. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen anyone do." Maria looked toward the compound where her teammates were helping the rescued hostages board evacuation helicopters. Children who had been imprisoned in darkness were seeing sunlight again, and families that had been separated were being reunited. The mission had been successful, and everyone was going home. "We saved them together," Maria replied, her voice weak but determined. "That's what teams do." The medical evacuation helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, and Maria was carefully loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the nearest military hospital. As the helicopter lifted off, she could see the compound below, now quiet and empty, except for the soldiers conducting final security sweeps. Lieutenant Peters appeared beside her stretcher, his face serious but relieved. "The hostages are all safe, and we didn't lose a single team member. You made the difference, Maria. Your coordination of air support saved this mission and probably saved all our lives." Maria nodded weakly, finally allowing exhaustion to overcome her determination. She had crawled 200 meters through hell with 2 shattered legs to coordinate the airstrikes that saved 40 innocent lives. It was an act of courage and determination that would become legendary among the soldiers who served with her, and a testament to the warrior spirit that defines the very best of America's military forces. As the helicopter flew toward safety and medical treatment, Maria closed her eyes and smiled. The mission was complete, the hostages were free, and her team was safe. Sometimes that was all that mattered in the world. The pilot acknowledged her transmission, and Maria began the final phase of her impossible journey. 100 meters had never seemed so far, but she was not going to stop now. 40 lives were depending on her ability to crawl through hell itself, and she was not going to let them down. Tejas, but her entire team.